So this also brings you to a very important question and an understanding of a mind frame. When you have to compare and say that, look at two lenses. A huge part of your career, you have been with behemoths in terms of global brands. You started with one, you continue now with one. In between, you've also been with brands who rose to be behemoths at an India level. And you were very lucky to see that journey.
Yes.
Now, if I have to ask you to step back and take out maybe 2 to 3 commonalities between a fire starter brand trying to be something big at a domestic level and a global behemoth, and say that this is where the DNA is alike. And this is where perhaps people trying to work in both places or getting an access from one to another can take as learnings to say that these commonalities will always be there. And parallel at the same time, if you have to talk about 2-3 things which are completely diverse, and not necessarily either pros or cons, but completely diverse, because the nature of the institutions are so diverse. And that also is a great learning for people trying to be a part of either of the ecosystem. What would those be?
Yeah. So I think the one commonality which I have been very, very fortunate to have in all the 4 organizations is the ability to be entrepreneurial and enterprising. I think all the 4 places that I worked in have allowed me to be extremely entrepreneurial and have given me the latitude and the space, and therefore our teams to do what we were able to achieve and accomplish in all of the places. So I think that was one commonality. So maybe I look for that, perhaps when I'm choosing. I think the second thing that has also been there as a trait in all is that actually all strive to disrupt. Whether it was Citibank, in its industry, it was always the disruptor. It was known as, the bank that got the first ATM to the country, did many firsts there. Paytm, many firsts. Clicks Capital was G Capital. So again, many firsts attributed to that history. Google is a disruptor in many ways. So I think that's one commonality. So that has made me a disruptor to an extent. So I think that's the second commonality. I think the third commonality that is there in all 4 is bold ambitions. कुछ करके दिखाना है, बहुत different करना है, बहुत बड़ा करना है, right? So I think that ambition, I think has only made my own ambition grow and get groomed over the years. So I think that's the third one. I would say the fourth one is it's perhaps the environment, but also because I think I'm somebody who cannot operate but for that, is the level of independence / accountability. I think all organizations gave extremely high responsibility with extremely high accountability. And I think that is something that I think is, if as an individual, one can understand that, with great power comes great responsibility, like Spider-Man says. Similarly, with great responsibility, you have to have high accountability. And if you can operate with that, I think that is something that makes you successful and makes you who you are. So I think those are 4 common things. The few things that are not common is, and I think both extremes are bad. So I think a balance is good. I think when you become really large, there are lots of processes. There are lots of systems. Essential because the cost of failure is high. And when you're a startup, there is no process. So a lot of things have to be repeated again and again and again. And there's a lot of efficiency that you lose because of that. So I feel both extremes are bad. The best is if the two can be blended, which is that you have processes, you have systems, but then you also allow for ability to discard systems and processes that don't serve the purpose and replace them with newer systems and processes. So have that agility and flexibility. I think that's one difference that I saw between startups versus large organizations. I think the one other thing which I think startups can learn from is the focus on people. I think large organizations have allowed themselves the luxury to invest in people processes, which means learning and development, which means cultural things, which means, mentoring programs, sponsorship programs, monitoring how your diversity ratios are going, monitoring how your teams are progressing and creating careers for them, not hiring somebody for this job here and now, but actually thinking of a person as human capital and not
A resource.
Right? So that difference of treating it as human capital versus resource, I think startups can gain from that. I think a lot of startups, and maybe I'm being generic here, but a lot of startups deal with a lot of attrition. The average lifespan of an employee in a startup is a few years if you're lucky. And that loses a lot of goodness of understanding the firm, the journey, the purpose, the ambition, collective ambition. So, you don't want to lose that, right? So how can you retain that and build further on that? I think that is something that is the other really big difference.
Very powerful and very, 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 it resonates also so well, because I know so many people who have had challenges with especially L1 and L2 movements. And a lot of times it's also not just because of opportunity. A lot of times it's also because of maybe culture mismanagement.
Yes.
Because it's very easy at times for hubris to set in.
Yes.
And if at the top order it sets in and it trickles down, it can create a very different atmosphere for people. And a lot of people don't want to be within that atmosphere. So I think culture is a very important part.
Absolutely.
There's no doubt about it.
I think the other thing that I at least have seen, because I work with a lot of startups, have in the past as well and even now, I think the one thing that startup founders or startups should watch out for is, building on the point that you're saying, they run a really high risk of promoting a sycophant culture. Right? And as a founder, that's your biggest risk. How do you remain available and accessible so that you can hear the bad news as well? Because all of the founders and startups have huge opportunities to grow, right? And they're extremely talented. But how do you make sure that you are always solving for these tripwires or blind spots that may come along the way? And I think that is very important. With large organizations, one of the things that has grown, perhaps by design, perhaps by just the sheer nature
Or vintage.
I'd like to believe there's design and there's intentionality in the design. See, chances are most organizations are matrix today, right? So if you're a leader or if you're a person, you will have your eyes and ears being fed in from different sources, which will hopefully alert you to anything that's not going right and also give you access to a brilliant idea that may otherwise not have found its way to you.
True.
If it's become very hierarchical, right? So I think that's one thing that, founders and startups should definitely cultivate as culture, that how is it that you're available to get both the good news and the bad news, the good ideas and the bad ideas.
More importantly, the bad news. The good news is not what you actually build on. Bad news is what you build on, because that's where foundation gets weak, and you need to strengthen that.